In this episode, we answer the question, why was General Douglas MacArthur called the American Caesar? And while you're listening to this, I invite you to post your thoughts and comments about the Civil War in general, or this episode in particular on our social media page. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe to get more of these episodes every week. So, why was General Douglas MacArthur called the American Caesar? As many of you already know, General Douglas MacArthur had an incredible military career. He served in the Philippine War, World War I, the occupation of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the Nicaraguan Revolution, the occupation of Veracruz, Mexico, and finally the Second World War. He commanded the U.S. forces in the Pacific during World War II, and he was known for his brilliant strategies and tactics and for his showmanship. However, his career ended in disgrace after he refused to obey orders from President Harry Truman in regard to the Korean War. His insubordination led to his dismissal by Truman. So how did he go from being one of America's greatest heroes to being relieved of duty in such a shameful way? Well, it all started when he was just a young lieutenant during the Civil War. On December 27, 1864, General Ulysses S. Grant met with President Abraham Lincoln in the White House. The two leaders discussed the future of the Union Army and what needed to be done to win the ongoing Civil War. At the time, the Union Army was bogged down in a stalemate in Virginia, and General Grant was looking for fresh ideas. That's when General Philip Sheridan entered the room. Sheridan had recently taken command of the Middle Department and had been successful in several battles against Confederate forces. He informed President Lincoln and General Grant that he had just received a report from General's report detailed an imminent Confederate invasion of Maryland, which could threaten Washington, D.C. if successful. This intelligence was confirmed by Union spies, and President Lincoln decided to move quickly to stop the threat. As a result, President Lincoln ordered General Grant to send a regiment north to defend the vulnerable area along the Potomac River. General Grant turned to the assembled officers and asked who would volunteer for this critical mission. Before anyone could respond, a young lieutenant named Douglas MacArthur stepped forward and exclaimed, "I will." When General Grant asked him if he was sure, MacArthur responded, "I am not only sure, but I am confident I can accomplish the mission and do it quickly." And so, without further ado, General Grant gave Lieutenant MacArthur command of a brigade consisting of 6 regiments. He then placed the brigade under the overall command of General, who was responsible for defending the area around Washington, D.C. Now, up until this point in the war, most military actions were small affairs involving at most a couple thousand troops. This made MacArthur's assignment even more unique because he was given command of over 10,000 men, which made it one of the largest commands given to any officer since the beginning of the war. General and his staff met with Lieutenant MacArthur and explained the situation. They told him that they needed him to get to the front as fast as possible, and that they expected him to stop the Confederate advance. MacArthur listened intently and took notes, but he didn't say a word. When the meeting was over, he excused himself and went to his quarters. That night, after everyone had gone home, MacArthur pulled out a map of the area and began to study it. He knew that the Confederates were planning to invade Maryland, and he wanted to get a head start on them. He also knew that his troops were exhausted and that they needed rest. But MacArthur was a man on a mission, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. He spent the entire night poring over the map, coming up with a plan. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, he had a clear idea of what he needed to do. He immediately sent orders to the different regiments under his command to begin marching. He told them to meet him at a small town called Hulltown, where he planned to set up his headquarters. From there, he would be able to monitor the situation and respond quickly if the Confederates attacked. The soldiers under his command were exhausted, but they knew that they had to move quickly. They didn't know exactly what MacArthur was planning, but they trusted him, and they were willing to follow him anywhere. They packed up their gear and started walking. As the days passed, MacArthur's small army grew larger. Soon, he had over 10,000 men under his command, all of them eager to get into the fight. But MacArthur was still not ready. He knew that he needed more supplies, and he wasn't going to move forward until he had them. He set up a supply depot in Hall Town and began receiving shipments of food, ammunition, and other supplies. He also set up a field hospital where wounded soldiers could receive treatment. Everything was going according to plan until the Confederates attacked. MacArthur was taken by surprise, and he barely managed to escape with his life. He retreated to Hall Town, where he regrouped his forces and prepared for the next Confederate attack. This time, he was ready and his troops fought back. The battle was fierce, but in the end, the Union soldiers prevailed. MacArthur had proven himself to be a capable commander and his reputation was made. In the following weeks, MacArthur and his troops chased the Confederates all the way back to Virginia. They engaged in several more battles, and each time MacArthur came out on top. He was considered a war hero, and people started calling him the American Caesar. However, MacArthur's victories had come at a cost. He had lost many good men and he knew that the war was far from over. He continued to train his troops and prepare for future battles. He also worked closely with other Union commanders to develop a strategy for winning the war. One day, MacArthur received an order from General Grant to report to his headquarters in Virginia. He knew that something important was about to happen, but he had no idea what it was. When he arrived at Grant's headquarters, he was informed that the Confederate Army had just surrendered. The Civil War was over, and the Union had won. MacArthur couldn't believe it. He had worked so hard for this moment, and now it was finally here. He was overjoyed, and he celebrated with his troops. In the weeks that followed, MacArthur was given command of the Army of Occupation. His job was to oversee the transition from wartime to peacetime and to help rebuild the South. He also worked to help former Confederate soldiers reintegrate into society. Throughout this time, MacArthur was seen as a hero. People flocked to him for autographs and photographs, and he was featured in newspapers and magazines all over the country. He was even invited to speak at the annual Commander's Banquet of the Army of the Potomac, an event attended by some of the most important people in the country. At the banquet, MacArthur stood up in front of the crowd and delivered a speech that would change everything. He spoke about the need for the North and the South to reunite and work together to make the country strong again. He emphasized the importance of forgiveness and understanding, and he urged the audience to move forward. Many people loved his speech and they praised him for his wisdom and maturity. However, others were not so happy with what he had said. They felt that he was a traitor to the Union cause, and they accused him of being a Confederate sympathizer. The controversy surrounding MacArthur's speech reached all the way to the White House, and President Abraham Lincoln was furious. He had not been consulted before MacArthur gave his speech, and he was angry that his friend and confidant, General Grant, had allowed it to happen. Lincoln summoned MacArthur to the White House and demanded an explanation. MacArthur tried to explain that he had only been trying to help the country heal, but Lincoln was not having it. He accused MacArthur of being insensitive and unpatriotic, and he relieved him of duty. Overnight, MacArthur went from being a celebrated war hero to being a disgraced general. He was devastated, but he knew that he had to move on with his life. He returned to his home in San Francisco and tried to pick up the pieces. He knew that he had made enemies in Washington, D.C., and he was concerned about what the future would hold for him. However, he was a proud man and he was determined to make the best of his situation. In the years that followed, MacArthur went on to have a long and successful military career. He commanded U.S. forces in several other wars, and he was considered one of the greatest military minds of his generation. He also became famous for his colorful personality and his flamboyant style. However, despite his success, he never forgot about the controversy surrounding his speech at the commander's banquet. He kept a copy of the speech in his desk, and he would read it every now and then. He knew that he had been wrong and he regretted what he had said. He carried the burden of his mistake for the rest of his life, and it was a constant reminder of the price of fame and the importance of discretion. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment below and tell us what you thought. If you'd like to learn more about the American Civil War, check out the playlist link below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. The American Caesar, that's what they called him. A title given to General Douglas MacArthur in the years before World War II for his victory in the Pacific and the way he used it to dominate the Philippines. But why did they call him the American Caesar? What was it about him that made him so similar to Julius Caesar, the famous Roman general who eventually became dictator of Rome? And how did MacArthur like this comparison? Well, let's find out. This is our channel. On August 4, 1920, General Tasker Bliss, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army at the time, died in office. And this was a problem because no one could replace him until October 1921. And who was chosen to lead the U.S. Army during this interim? Who else but General Douglas MacArthur? He would only be the acting Chief of Staff, of course, but still, that's quite an important role. And it allowed MacArthur to get a lot of power in the U.S. Army. However, soon after taking up the post, MacArthur began making some enemies. One of them was Major General George Keeney, the head of the Army's War College, who criticized MacArthur's proposed Army reorganization plan. So MacArthur went over Keeney's head and got him fired. And when he replaced Keeney with Major General Charles G. Morgan, he put another nail in his own coffin. You see, Morgan was an old West Pointer, and the fact that MacArthur bypassed his senior by getting him fired caused a major rift between the two. Soon, much of the Army High Command were against MacArthur. They felt he was trying to take control of the entire army and make himself the most powerful man in Washington. It didn't help that MacArthur played into this narrative by wearing his military uniform around town, something the army forbade. But MacArthur didn't care. He knew his actions were causing resentment against him, but he didn't care. In fact, he wanted all the power the army could give him. After all, he had designs on becoming the President of the United States. And it wasn't just the people in the army who were wary of MacArthur. The American public was also split on him. Why? Because while MacArthur was considered a national hero for his actions in the Philippines, others saw him as a warmonger. When he left the Philippines in March 1926, he told President Calvin Coolidge, "The Pacific is our ocean, not the Pacific, but our Pacific." And then he gave a speech at the University of Virginia in 1927 where he said that the U.S. shouldn't pull out of the Caribbean and that Americans should prepare for war. "We must either be aggressively neutral or we must go to war," he said. And that last part was music to the ears of isolationists who believed the U.S. should stay out of world affairs. But isolationism was slowly losing steam in America and internationalism was gaining momentum thanks to the Great Depression. This economic crisis was hurting Americans abroad and interventionism seemed like the best way to protect American interests. In other words, MacArthur's ideas were beginning to gain traction among the American public, and his enemies in the army were now being sidelined. For example, the army thought MacArthur's plans to reorganize the army were foolish, and they refused to implement any of them. But they also suffered a major defeat when the U.S. Congress approved the construction of the aircraft carriers Lexington and Saratoga despite the Army's opposition. This made MacArthur very popular in the Army and with the American public, which led to him being appointed commander of the newly created Philippine Department in June 1930. His enemies might have thwarted his efforts to become Chief of Staff, but there was nothing they could do to stop him from returning to the Philippines. And MacArthur was happy to return to the Philippines. Just 5 years prior, he had left the islands a hero. So what better way to become a legend than to return and make the islands even better? At least that was what he thought. But as soon as he arrived, he realized things were bad. In spite of the U.S. spending millions of dollars on infrastructure projects, the Philippines was still riddled with bad roads, few bridges, and terrible communications. On top of that, there were still a few pockets of Filipino guerrillas holding out against the U.S. Still, MacArthur was undeterred. He would fix these problems in no time and make the Philippines even better than it was before. And then he'd return to America and finally achieve his goal of becoming president. But it wouldn't be easy. He started his job by rounding up all the guerrillas, and by 1931, he had crushed them all. But the infrastructure projects weren't as easy to complete. Even though the U.S. was paying for it, local politicians refused to cooperate unless MacArthur agreed to fund local projects with his own department budget. And he couldn't do that because the U.S. had already allocated all the funds for the Philippine department. This meant that MacArthur had little choice but to rely on the cooperation of local politicians to finish all these projects. And who could blame them for not cooperating? Sure, they benefited from the U.S. as financial assistance, but so did everyone else. In the Philippines, they weren't going to let some upstart general boss them around. To solve this issue, MacArthur decided to play to his greatest strength, his personality. Wherever he went, he charmed everyone and won them over to his side. By 1935, the projects were back on track and the Philippines was finally starting to look like the American colony it was supposed to be. But this isn't where the story gets interesting. You see, MacArthur was so popular in the Philippines that many people wanted him to be their president once they gained independence from the U.S. And he encouraged these calls, which caused even more resentment among the local elite. They knew MacArthur would never become president of the Philippines, but if he won, it would only embolden him to try and take control of the U.S. government and make himself president of the United States. So they began plotting to get MacArthur out of the Philippines, first by writing articles criticizing him, and then by pressuring President Franklin D. Roosevelt to relieve him of duty. In January 1937, Roosevelt met with MacArthur and told him he was relieving him of duty. MacArthur was furious, but he couldn't fight the president, so he resigned. And when he returned to America, he retired from public life. At least that was what everyone thought. You see, MacArthur didn't really retire. He was just biding his time until he could strike back and win the presidency. But the road to the White House was long and he had a lot of free time on his hands. So instead of planning his presidential run, he took a vacation to Hawaii. That's where he heard about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. When he heard this, he immediately flew back to Washington and went straight to the White House. There he told Roosevelt that he was needed in the Pacific and offered his services. Roosevelt was hesitant at first, but MacArthur's reputation as a great general was too good to pass up. He accepted MacArthur's offer and placed him in charge of the Pacific Theater. And then MacArthur did what he always did. He put on a great show. He recaptured island after island and pushed the Japanese further and further back until he reached the Philippines in October 1944. Now this is where the story takes a turn for the worse. You see, when MacArthur retook the Philippines, he did exactly what the local elite feared he would do. He essentially turned the Philippines into his personal fiefdom. For example, he forced the Philippine president to resign and install his own hand-picked puppet. He also took control of the Philippine treasury and began spending money like crazy. Then, when the guerrilla leaders complained about his actions, he threatened to arrest them for sedition. In fact, he arrested anyone who opposed him, whether they were guerrillas or members of the Philippine government. He even arrested the new president he had installed and held him in a Manila hotel under guard. And it wasn't just the Philippine government and guerrilla leaders who hated him. The American public was also beginning to sour on him because, as the war dragged on, his popularity waned. And then came the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. MacArthur thought it would be a decisive victory for the Allies, but he was wrong. While the Allies did win, the Japanese Navy was still afloat and the war in the Pacific was far from over. As the fighting continued, MacArthur's popularity plummeted, and so did Roosevelt's trust in him. In fact, Roosevelt was ready to fire MacArthur, but he didn't because he couldn't find a replacement. That's why when the war ended, he allowed MacArthur to keep his post. But he also made sure to limit his power by placing other generals in positions of power that MacArthur couldn't touch. This effectively neutered MacArthur, and he spent the rest of the war as a figurehead. He was still popular with the troops, but that didn't matter because he had no real power anymore. And when he tried to regain some of that power after the war ended, he was fired by President Harry Truman. That's why MacArthur is known as the American Caesar. He tried to become the dictator of the Philippines and failed. What do you think? Do you think MacArthur would have become president if he hadn't been relieved of duty in the Philippines? Or do you think he was destined to fail? Let us know your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out our new series. Thanks for watching. Douglas MacArthur was known as a strongman during World War II. But what did he do to earn that title? That's what we're going to look at today. This is part of a series where I look at some of the biggest names in history and try to figure out if they would have been considered a strongman by today's standards. If you want more information about this series or the other videos I make, check out the links in the description below. Now let's get into it. So when most people think of a strongman, they think of someone who can lift heavy things like cars or trucks. And while that is one way of defining a strong man, I'm going to be taking a slightly different approach for this series. I'm going to be looking at how people viewed these historical figures and whether or not they had the characteristics that people today might view as strong. In other words, were they strong in the sense that they were powerful, confident, and capable? So with that in mind, let us take a look at 5 things that MacArthur did during World War II that made him seem like a strong man. Number 1. MacArthur led the Philippines campaign. By the time December 1941 rolled around, American and Filipino troops were well aware that an attack from Japan was imminent. In fact, just weeks before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt even ordered American troops to prepare for a Japanese attack in the Pacific. Even so, no one was really sure how serious the threat was or how quickly the Japanese might move. Many American commanders, including General MacArthur, felt confident that they were ready for whatever the Japanese had to offer. On December 8, 1941, American and Filipino troops began an aggressive defensive posture against the Japanese. The goal was to inflict as many casualties as possible while retreating to more defensible positions. On the first day of battle, MacArthur felt confident that his men were holding their own against the Japanese. He even went to the radio to announce to the Filipino people that the situation was under control. He said, "The President of the United States has just been informed by the American minister in Manila that the Japanese have attacked our forces in the Philippines. I have talked with the President. We are prepared for this, and we shall resist." He then told the Filipinos not to be alarmed, and that everything was under control. Unfortunately, it wasn't under control, and over the next several months, MacArthur and his men would be pushed further and further back by the Japanese. By March 1942, MacArthur and his men had retreated to Bataan in the northern part of the Philippines. Here, MacArthur worked tirelessly to organize and train new recruits while also trying to coordinate with other Allied forces in the area. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, MacArthur managed to hold off the Japanese for several more months. Finally, on April 9, 1942, MacArthur and his men were forced to surrender to the Japanese. While this may seem like a failure, it was actually a strategic move on MacArthur's part. He knew that his men were exhausted and starving, and that they couldn't keep up the fight much longer. So he surrendered in order to preserve his force and give them a chance to regroup and fight another day. Overall, MacArthur's leadership during the Philippines campaign was nothing short of impressive. He refused to give up despite being outnumbered and outgunned, and he always put the needs of his men first. These are the qualities of a true strongman. 2. MacArthur accepted the surrender of Japan. After the successful completion of the island-hopping campaign, the Allies had essentially trapped the Japanese army on the island of Japan. The only thing left to do was to accept Japan's surrender. This was a very delicate situation since the Allies didn't want to make the Japanese feel like they were being humiliated. They also didn't want to give the impression that they were weak. As such, it was decided that General MacArthur would be the one to accept Japan's surrender. On September 2, 1945, representatives from Japan met with MacArthur aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Japanese surrendered unconditionally to the Allies, thus ending World War II. For MacArthur, this was the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. He had led the Allies to victory against all odds, and now he was going to play a key role in ending the conflict. MacArthur's acceptance of Japan's surrender was a defining moment not only for himself but for the entire world. It was a moment that symbolized the end of a horrific conflict and the beginning of a new era. And there's probably no better way to go out than that. Strong men often find themselves in positions of power and influence, and MacArthur's actions during World War II certainly qualified him for such a position. His leadership, courage, and determination were on full display during the war, and it's no surprise that he was seen as a strong man by those around him. No. 3. MacArthur kept his word. During the Pacific War, Australian Lieutenant General Thomas Blamey visited MacArthur's headquarters. He wanted to discuss the possibility of launching a joint Australian-American offensive on the island of Borneo. However, when Blamey brought up the subject, MacArthur was not interested. MacArthur believed that Borneo was not worth the resources it would take to capture it. Plus, he was already planning his own offensive on the Island of Light. When Blamey heard this, he was disappointed, but he respected MacArthur's decision. However, just a few months later, it became clear that MacArthur had made a mistake. The Japanese were planning to use Borneo as a base to launch attacks on the Allies. This meant that capturing the island was more important than MacArthur had originally thought. Blamey was proven right. Had MacArthur listened to him in the first place, many lives could have been saved. Still, MacArthur never went back on his word. He could have easily said that the situation had changed and that he was no longer committed to his previous statement. But he didn't. Instead, he stuck by his guns and honored his commitment not to attack Borneo. This is a rare quality in any individual, but it's especially rare in a military leader. After all, military leaders are often forced to make tough decisions with little or no time to think about the consequences. In addition, they're often second-guessed by politicians and the public. Despite all this, MacArthur was a man of his word, and he never wavered from his commitments. This is a quality that many people admire in a strong man. 4. MacArthur was a brilliant strategist. One of the most important things that a general can do is develop a good strategy. A good strategy is essential if a military force is going to be successful. In order to develop a good strategy, a general needs to be able to think ahead and anticipate what his enemy will do. They also need to be able to come up with a plan that is both effective and efficient. MacArthur demonstrated his strategic brilliance during the liberation of the Philippines. The Japanese had fortified the island heavily, so it was clear that a frontal assault would be costly in terms of both lives and resources. Instead, MacArthur opted to take a more surgical approach. Without these things, troops are likely to be defeated, even if they are fighting a weaker enemy. One of the things that set MacArthur apart from other generals was his ability to keep his troops supplied with everything they needed. This was especially impressive considering the difficult terrain and the constant threat of attack from the Japanese. For example, during the New Guinea campaign, MacArthur's men had to contend with thick jungle, rugged mountains, and malaria-infested swamps. But even in these conditions, MacArthur's troops were well supplied, and they were able to fight effectively. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the thumbs up button below to let me know. You can also subscribe to my channel to get notifications about my latest videos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.